The fog rolled across the shattered runway like a living thing, clinging to the bomb craters and twisted metal that littered Flensburg-Schaefer House airfield in the pre-dawn darkness of May 8, 1945. The war was over. Everyone knew it. The surrender had been signed. The guns had fallen silent. But someone forgot to tell the Focke-Wulf that appeared out of the mist at 0547 hours. Corporal James Hutchins of the British Royal Air Force Regiment stood watch at the perimeter, his Lee Enfield rifle slung over his shoulder, a cigarette burning down to his fingers. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, part of the occupation force securing what remained of the Luftwaffe's northern installations. The Germans had abandoned this place 3 days ago, fled south or melted into the civilian population. The hangars stood empty, their doors hanging open like broken jaws. Burnt documents still smoldered in oil drums scattered across the tarmac. Then he heard it. The sound came from the north, carried on the wind, a deep rhythmic thrumming that made his chest vibrate. An aircraft engine. Not the smooth purr of a British Spitfire or the throaty growl of an American P-51. This was the distinctive sound of a BMW 801 radial engine, 14 cylinders hammering in perfect synchronization. A sound that belonged to only one aircraft, the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Hutchins threw his cigarette down and brought his rifle to port arms, scanning the gray sky. His breath came in short bursts, forming clouds in the cold morning air. The engine noise grew louder, closer, impossibly close. And then he saw it. It emerged from the fog bank like a ghost, a Focke-Wulf FW-190A8, its camouflage paint scheme of dark green and gray mottled across its fuselage, the black cross of the Luftwaffe still visible on its wings. The aircraft was flying low, perhaps 200 feet above the ground, wobbling slightly as it approached the runway. The landing gear was down. The pilot was attempting to land. Contact! Contact! Enemy aircraft! Hutchins shouted, but his voice seemed swallowed by the engine roar. Other soldiers emerged from their positions, scrambling for weapons, pointing at the sky. But no one fired. The war was over. The surrender had been signed. What the hell was this pilot thinking? The Focke-Wulf touched down hard on the cratered runway, its tires screeching against concrete, the aircraft bouncing once, twice, before settling into a rolling landing. Black smoke puffed from the exhausts as the pilot cut the throttle. The propeller spun down to a stop, the blades freezing in position like the hands of a broken clock. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The aircraft sat there in the middle of the runway, engine ticking as it cooled, the morning fog swirling around its landing gear. British soldiers formed a cautious semicircle around it, rifles raised, safeties off. Lieutenant David Morrison pushed through the group, his service revolver drawn, his eyes fixed on the cockpit canopy. "No sudden moves," he called out in German, his accent thick but understandable. "Pilot, exit the aircraft with your hands visible." Silence. Morrison took 3 steps closer, his boots crunching on debris. The canopy was closed, but he could see movement inside, or thought he could. Shadows shifting behind the armored glass. "I said exit the aircraft. Now." Still nothing. Morrison gestured to 2 soldiers. "Corporal Hutchins, Private Davies, with me. Keep your weapons ready." They approached the Focke-Wulf from opposite sides, moving in tactical formation, every nerve on fire. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. The war was over. The Luftwaffe had been grounded. Every German pilot had been accounted for, captured, or killed. Where had this aircraft come from? Morrison reached the fuselage and placed his hand against it. The metal was cold, far colder than it should have been after flight. Ice crystals clung to the rivets. He looked up at the cockpit, at the frosted glass of the canopy. "Cover me," he said. He climbed onto the wing, his feet finding purchase on the non-slip surface, and reached for the canopy release. The mechanism was stiff, frozen perhaps, but it gave way with a metallic click. He pushed the canopy back on its rails, and it slid open with a groan. The cockpit was empty. Morrison blinked, leaned closer, looked again. No pilot. No body. The seat was there, the harness unbuckled and hanging loose, the control column centered. The instrument panel showed nothing unusual. Fuel gauges reading empty, altimeter showing 200 feet, airspeed indicator at 0. The oxygen mask hung from its mount, swaying slightly in the breeze. But there was no pilot. "Lieutenant," Hutchins called from below. "What you got?" Morrison didn't answer immediately. He was staring at something else now, something that made his skin crawl. On the seat, pressed into the worn leather, was a perfect impression, as if someone had been sitting there moments ago. The leather was still compressed, still holding the shape of a human body. And it was warm. "Sir." Hutchins called again, more urgently. Morrison touched the seat. Heat radiated from it, the warmth of a living person who had just stood up and walked away. But there was nowhere to walk. The canopy had been closed from the inside. The aircraft had been airborne minutes ago. And now the cockpit was empty. "Get flight command on the radio," Morrison said quietly, his voice tight. "Tell them we have a situation. Tell them I don't know what the hell we have." He climbed down from the wing, his mind racing. The other soldiers were searching the area around the aircraft, looking for tracks, for any sign of where the pilot might have gone. But the concrete showed nothing. The fog revealed nothing. The Focke-Wulf sat silent on the runway, its engine cold, its cockpit empty, its secrets locked somewhere between earth and sky. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, Morrison could have sworn he heard voices, German voices, speaking in urgent whispers, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mystery had landed. The hunt was about to begin. Within 3 hours, Flensburg-Schaefer House Airfield had transformed from a quiet occupation zone into a hive of military activity. 3 intelligence officers from RAF Intelligence Branch arrived in an olive-drab staff car, their faces grim and businesslike. Behind them came a technical crew from the Air Ministry's enemy aircraft flight, equipped with cameras, tools, and notebooks. By 0900 hours, the Focke-Wulf had been surrounded by a cordon of armed guards, and the investigation had begun in earnest. Wing Commander Peter Ashford stood beside the aircraft, watching as his technicians crawled over every inch of its surface. He was a veteran of photo reconnaissance analysis, a man who'd spent 4 years studying German aircraft, identifying variants, tracking modifications. He knew Focke-Wulfs. He'd seen hundreds of them, in photographs, in gun camera footage, in smoking wreckage across France and Germany. But he'd never seen one like this. "Serial number," called out Flight Sergeant Graham Miller, reading from the fuselage data plate. 173092. Manufactured at Focke-Wulf Marienburg facility, November 1944. Ashford made a note. "Check it against the registry." 10 minutes later, Miller returned with a thick folder, the captured Luftwaffe production records, seized from the Marienburg factory when Soviet forces overran it in January. He flipped through pages of typewritten German text, his finger running down columns of numbers. "Found it, sir. Aircraft 173092, FW-190A-8, delivered to JG-26, Jagerschwader 26, the Abbeville Boys, on November 28, 1944. Assigned to 8th Staffel." And Miller's face went pale. "And destroyed on December 23, 1944, during Operation Bodenplatte preliminary missions. Pilot was Unteroffizier Klaus Richter. Shot down over Belgium by American anti-aircraft fire. Both aircraft and pilot confirmed lost." Ashford took the file, read it himself. The words were clear, the date unambiguous. December 23, 1944. Nearly 5 months ago. Confirmed destroyed. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. But there it is." Ashford walked around the aircraft slowly, his trained eye cataloging every detail. The paintwork was weathered but intact, no signs of recent repair or repaint. The aircraft showed combat wear, small dents in the cowling, a patch on the starboard wing where flak damage had been repaired, carbon scoring around the gun ports of the 420mm MG-151 cannons. This was a fighting aircraft, one that had seen action. But it shouldn't exist. He climbed onto the wing and examined the cockpit more closely. The instrument panel was standard FW-190A, 8 configuration. Artificial horizon, airspeed indicator, altimeter, engine gauges, fuel indicators. Everything was in German, everything was period correct. He checked the ammunition counters for the cannons. All showed 0 rounds remaining. The guns had been fired empty. "Sir, you need to see this," called out Lieutenant Morrison, who'd been assigned to assist the investigation. He was standing near the tail of the aircraft, pointing at something. Ashford jumped down and joined him. Morrison was indicating the rudder, where someone had painted a series of small victory markings, white silhouettes of Allied aircraft. Ashford counted them: 3 Spitfires, 2 P-47 Thunderbolts, 1 B-17 Flying Fortress. 6 kills, Morrison said. But according to the records, Unteroffizier Richter only had 4 confirmed victories. Ashford stared at the markings. Fresh paint. Recent additions. But how recent? Inside the cockpit, the technicians had begun a systematic inventory. They found a leather flight jacket draped over the seat back, size medium, with the insignia of JG-26 stitched onto the shoulder. In the map case, they discovered navigation charts of northwestern Germany and Denmark, marked with pencil notations in German script. The most recent notation was dated May 7, 1945, yesterday. In the jacket pocket, they found a letter. It was written on standard Luftwaffe correspondence paper, creased from being folded and refolded many times. The handwriting was neat, precise. It was addressed to Mein liebst Greta, my dearest Greta. Flight Officer Sarah Winters, a German translator attached to RAF Intelligence, read it aloud, translating as she went. My dearest Greta, if you are reading this, then I have not returned. I want you to know that I flew with honor, that I did my duty to the end, even when the end was certain. The war is lost. We all know this now, though we dare not speak it openly. But there are still missions to fly, still orders to follow, still comrades who depend on us. I think often of our last evening together, of the way the sunset looked over the fields behind your father's house. I carry that image with me every time I climb into the cockpit. It reminds me that there is beauty in this world, even when surrounded by so much darkness. Take care of yourself. Remember me not as a soldier, but as the boy who asked you to dance at the summer festival in 1938, who was too nervous to speak, who loved you from the first moment. Whatever happens, I am content. I have lived. I have loved. I have flown. Yours always, Klaus. The tent fell silent. Even the hardened intelligence officers seemed affected. This was no propaganda piece, no heroic declaration. It was a goodbye letter from a young man who knew he was going to die. Check the date, Ashford said quietly. Winters examined the letter more closely. It's undated, sir. But the paper, it's aged. This wasn't written recently. Ashford took the letter, held it up to the light. The paper had the yellow tinge of age, the slight brittleness of documents months or years old. And yet it had been in the jacket pocket of an aircraft that landed this morning. What else? He demanded. The technicians pulled out more items, a half-empty pack of German cigarettes, Eckstein brand, common Luftwaffe issue. A small photograph of a young woman standing in a field, smiling at the camera. Greta, presumably. A compass. A pencil stub. A crumpled map of the Baltic coast. And something else. Something that made Ashford's blood run cold. At the bottom of the map case, wrapped in oilcloth, was a mission log, the pilot's personal flight record. Miller handed it to Ashford, who unwrapped it carefully. The log was standard issue, a small notebook with columns for date, mission type, aircraft number, duration, and remarks. The entries were in Klaus Richter's handwriting, matching the letter perfectly. The final entry was dated May 8, 1945, this morning, at 0530 hours. It read, "Final patrol. Fuel critical. Weather impossible. Cannot find base. Cannot find anything. The fog has taken everything. I am going home." Below that, in different handwriting, larger, more frantic, were 3 words scratched deep into the paper. "Where is everyone?" Ashford felt the skin on the back of his neck prickle. He looked up at the Focke-Wulf, sitting silent on the runway, its empty cockpit like a missing tooth in a skull's grin. "Sir," said Miller hesitantly, "if Richter was shot down in December and this aircraft was confirmed destroyed, then who landed this morning? And where did they go?" Ashford had no answer. The physical evidence contradicted itself at every turn. The aircraft existed but shouldn't. The pilot had died 5 months ago but had apparently flown this morning. The letter was old but the mission log was fresh. Everything was wrong. He turned to Morrison. "I want a complete forensic examination. Fingerprints from the controls, analysis of the fuel residue, metallurgical testing on the airframe. I want to know if this aircraft has been sitting in a field somewhere being rebuilt, or if—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Or if what, sir?" Morrison asked. Ashford looked at the fog that still clung to the edges of the airfield, refusing to burn off despite the rising sun. "Or if something else is happening here. Something we don't understand." That afternoon, the fingerprint analysis came back. The prints found on the control column, the canopy release, the throttle quadrant, all matched prints on file for Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, killed in action December 23, 1944. A dead man had landed this aircraft. And then he had vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions, a warm seat, and the whisper of German voices on the wind. The breakthrough came at 1,647 hours, when a young corporal from the Royal Engineers, assigned to clear unexploded ordnance from the airfield's eastern perimeter, discovered something that had been hidden beneath a collapsed hangar wall. It was another Focke-Wulf FW-190, or rather, what was left of one. Wing Commander Ashford received the call and immediately drove to the location, a partially demolished maintenance hangar at the far end of the runway, one that had been marked for demolition but not yet cleared. The hangar's roof had caved in during an RAF bombing raid weeks earlier, and the interior was a chaos of twisted girders, shattered concrete, and rusted equipment. The aircraft sat in the back corner, covered in debris and dust, its wings crumpled, its fuselage riddled with bullet holes. It looked like it had been there for months. Ashford approached slowly, his boots crunching on broken glass. The technicians were already swarming over it, clearing away rubble, taking photographs. Flight Sergeant Miller emerged from behind the wreckage, his face ashen. "Sir, you're not going to believe this." "Try me," Ashford said grimly. Nothing surprised him any more. Miller led him to the fuselage, where he'd cleared away enough debris to reveal the data plate. Serial number 173092. "It's the same aircraft, sir. The exact same one that landed this morning." Ashford stared at the number, then at the wreckage, then back at the pristine Focke-Wulf sitting on the runway 300 yards away. "That's impossible. We've been guarding that aircraft all day. It hasn't moved." "I know, sir. But look at this." Miller pointed to the cockpit. The canopy was shattered, blown apart from the inside, or from the outside, Ashford couldn't tell. The seat was there, the harness torn, hanging in shreds. And slumped over the control column, still strapped into the seat despite the torn harness, was a body. A German pilot, his leather flight jacket rotted and stained, his face hidden beneath a cracked oxygen mask. Ashford felt his heart hammering. Get him out. Carefully. It took 20 minutes to extricate the body from the wreckage. The corpse was in advanced decomposition, not fresh, not recent. Months old, at least. The flight jacket bore the insignia of JG-26. In the breast pocket, they found identity papers. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter. Born March 15, 1923, in Bremen. Blood type A. Religion, Protestant. The same man whose fingerprints were on the controls of the aircraft sitting on the runway. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered, standing behind Ashford. He's been here the whole time. Ashford examined the wreckage more closely. The damage pattern told a story. Heavy machine gun fire from above and behind, consistent with an attack by Allied fighters. The engine was seized, the cowling punctured in dozens of places. The fuel tanks showed evidence of fire, long since burned out. This aircraft had been shot down, had crashed here, and had been sitting in this hangar ever since. But that didn't explain the other one. The pristine one. The one that had landed this morning with warm seats and fresh mission logs. "Sir," called out one of the technicians, a young man named Thompson. He was examining the instrument panel of the wrecked aircraft, prying away shattered glass. "The altimeter is still functional. It's reading. That's odd." "What?" Ashford demanded. "It's reading 32,000 feet, sir. As if the aircraft is still at altitude." Ashford felt a chill run through him. He looked at the altimeter, at the needle pointing stubbornly at 32,000. Frozen there. Locked in time. The same altitude shown on the pristine aircraft's instruments. And then he understood. Or thought he did. Or began to grasp the edges of something vast and incomprehensible. "Get me the meteorological reports from December 23, 1944, he said urgently. "The day Richter was shot down." It took an hour to locate the archived weather data from RAF Coastal Command. When it arrived, Ashford spread the reports across a makeshift table in the hangar. His finger traced the synoptic charts, the pressure systems, the frontal boundaries. On December 23, 1944, a massive Arctic front had swept down from Norway, colliding with warmer air over the Baltic Sea. The collision had created what the meteorologists called extreme atmospheric instability, violent updrafts, downdrafts, ice formation at all altitudes. Visibility near zero. Radio communications impossible. Several aircraft, both Allied and German, had been reported missing that day, lost in the storm. Including Klaus Richter. "He didn't crash here," Ashford said slowly, working through the implications. "Not initially. He was shot down over Belgium, damaged, tried to make it back to base. Got caught in the storm over the Baltic. Climbed to 32,000 feet trying to get above it. And then—" He paused, struggling with words to describe the impossible. "And then," Morrison prompted. "And then something happened. Something in that storm, at that altitude, in those conditions. Something that displaced him." "Displaced him where, sir?" Ashford looked at the two aircraft, the wreck and the pristine copy, and felt reality bending around him. "Not where. When." The sun was setting when Sarah Winters made the final discovery. She'd been re-examining the mission log, the one found in the pristine aircraft, applying various analytical techniques to determine its age. Under ultraviolet light, something became visible that hadn't been apparent before. Writing. Additional writing. Faint, almost invisible, in the margins of the final page. She photographed it, enhanced the image, and brought it to Ashford. The writing was German, the same handwriting as the rest of the log, but more frantic, more desperate. It read, "I have been flying for hours. The fuel gauge shows empty, but the engine continues. The radio produces only static. Below me I see cities that are dark, no lights, no fires. I descended over Flensburg, but the airfield is gone. not destroyed, but changed. Different buildings. Different layout. I climbed back to altitude. The fog returned. Inside the fog I saw other aircraft, shadows only. I heard voices on the radio, German voices, but they fade before I can respond. I am not alone in this storm, but I am completely alone. The sun has set and risen 3 times, but my watch shows only 6 hours have passed. Time is broken here. Space is broken. I am caught between what was and what will be. I see the airfield again. It looks more familiar now. I am going to try to land. Perhaps if I can just land, if I can touch the ground, I can be real again. I can be home again. If you find this, tell Greta I tried to come home. Tell her I am sorry. The final word was smeared, as if the writer's hand had been shaking. Ashford read it 3 times, each time hoping the words would change, would make more sense, would be less terrifying. But they remained the same. He was caught in a loop, Winters said quietly. Trapped between December 1944 and May 1945. Flying in circles through time, trying to find his way home. And this morning? Morrison asked. Ashford looked toward the runway, where the pristine Focke-Wulf sat in the gathering darkness. This morning, the loop released him. Or he finally found the right moment. He landed, exactly as he described. And then what happened to him? Ashford thought of the warm seat, the unbuckled harness, the empty cockpit. He thought of Klaus Richter's body, decomposed and cold, slumped in the wreckage of his aircraft in the hangar. He thought of the letter to Greta, the victory markings, the desperate words in the margins of the mission log. I think, he said slowly, that when he finally touched the ground, when the aircraft became real again, solid again, fixed in time and space, I think he remembered. He remembered that he'd been dead for 5 months. That he'd crashed. That he'd died. And reality corrected itself. He went where he'd always been. Where he should have been. In the wreckage. In the hangar. Dead since December. But his fingerprints were fresh, sir. The seat was warm. Ashford had no answer for that. Or perhaps he did, and simply couldn't voice it. Perhaps Klaus Richter had been both alive and dead, real and unreal, present and absent, for 5 months. Perhaps he'd flown through a storm that bent the rules of existence itself, becoming a ghost, a memory, a possibility that refused to fully resolve into either life or death. Until this morning, when he'd finally found his way home. The fog rolled back across the airfield as darkness fell, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the runway, the hangars, the 2 Focke-Wulfs, one pristine, one destroyed, both impossibly the same. And somewhere in that fog, just for a moment, Ashford heard it, the sound of a BMW 801 engine, 14 cylinders hammering in perfect synchronization, growing louder and then fading away, as if an aircraft was taking off into an invisible sky. He never heard it again. They buried Klaus Richter on May 12, 1945, in a small military cemetery outside Flensburg. It was a gray day, the kind of day where the sky and the earth seemed to merge into a single colorless expanse. 27 German pilots were interred that afternoon, all casualties of the final months of the war, all found in wreckage scattered across northern Germany. Richter's was the only coffin that required 2 services. The first was held at the cemetery, a brief military ceremony attended by British occupation forces and a German chaplain who'd been permitted to conduct the rites. There were no family members present, no Greta, no parents, no friends. Just soldiers burying a soldier, completing the necessary paperwork, fulfilling the requirements of military law. The second service happened at the airfield, and it was entirely unofficial. Wing Commander Ashford organized it himself, without authorization, without fanfare. He gathered Morrison, Miller, Winters, and a handful of the men who'd been present when the Focke-Wulf landed. They stood in a semicircle around the pristine aircraft, which had been cordoned off and would soon be dismantled and shipped to England for further analysis. No one spoke for a long time. The wind moved through the empty hangars, creating sounds like whispered conversations in a language just beyond understanding. Finally, Ashford broke the silence. In my career, I've analyzed thousands of aircraft. I've studied their construction, their capabilities, their weaknesses. I've treated them as machines, as collections of metal and rivets and engineering principles. He paused, placing his hand on the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. But this one was different. This one was alive, in a way I can't explain. It carried someone home, even after death. It refused to let go of its pilot. It completed its mission. "What do you think happened to him, sir?" asked Miller. "To Richter, when he stepped out of the cockpit." Ashford had been thinking about that question for 3 days. The official report, the one he'd submitted to RAF intelligence, spoke of unexplained atmospheric phenomena, possible hallucination by sleep-deprived personnel, coincidental discovery of a crashed aircraft with similar serial numbers. It was safe, rational, defensible. It was also a lie. "I think," Ashford said carefully, "that he walked into the fog and found what he'd been looking for. Whether that was death, or peace, or home, I don't know. But I think he found it." Sarah Winters stepped forward, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I located Greta, Klaus Richter's fiancée. She's living with her parents in Bremen, in the British occupation zone. I took the liberty of sending her his personal effects. The letter, the photograph, his logbook." "And?" Morrison asked. And she replied. She said she'd known since December that he was gone. She'd felt it, she said. But she also said that 3 nights ago, the night before the aircraft landed, she'd dreamed of him. He was flying through clouds, looking for something, calling her name. And then he smiled, waved to her, and disappeared into light. No one said anything. The wind continued its ghostly conversation. "What about the aircraft itself?" Morrison asked. "What will happen to it?" Ashford had received his orders that morning. "It's being classified under the Emergency Powers Act. All evidence will be sealed. The wreckage in the hangar will be destroyed. This aircraft will be dismantled and the parts scattered. The investigation will be closed. Officially, nothing unusual happened here." "That's absurd," Morrison protested. "We have physical evidence, witness testimony, documented anomalies." "We have," Ashford interrupted, "a situation that contradicts everything we understand about reality. And in 1945, with the world trying to rebuild itself, with millions dead and millions more trying to make sense of it all, the last thing anyone needs is evidence that the rules of existence can be broken, that time and space can be torn apart, that death itself might not be permanent." He looked at each of them in turn. "What happened here will be forgotten. Intentionally. Necessarily. Because if people knew, if they really believed, that Klaus Richter flew for 5 months after dying, that he existed in multiple states simultaneously, that he finally came home through sheer force of will or cosmic accident, they would demand answers. And we have none to give." The dismantling began the next morning. Ashford supervised personally, ensuring that every component was catalogued, every serial number recorded. The engine was separated from the airframe. The wings were detached. The fuselage was cut into sections. Each piece was labeled and crated for shipment to different facilities across England, where they would be studied in isolation, their origin obscured, their context erased. But before the cockpit section was removed, Ashford climbed inside one final time. He sat in the pilot's seat, the same seat where Klaus Richter had sat, where his body had left an impression in the leather, where the warmth of his presence had lingered. The instruments were dark now, the switches all in the off position. The control column was still, locked in neutral. Ashford closed his eyes and tried to imagine it, The storm, the altitude, the desperate climb through clouds that refused to obey the laws of physics. The moment when Klaus Richter realized he was lost, not just in space but in time itself. The hours or days or months he'd spent flying in circles, seeing cities that weren't quite right, hearing voices that faded before they could be answered. And finally, the relief of seeing Flensburg-Schaefer House Airfield emerge from the fog, looking almost familiar, almost like home. The decision to land. The touchdown. The moment of hope. And then the terrible understanding. The memory returning. The awareness that he'd been dead all along, that this was just an echo, a resonance, a final flight through impossible skies. Had he been afraid? Or relieved? Did he walk away willingly, or was he pulled back to where he belonged, to the wreckage, to the cold metal, to the completion of a death that had been delayed but never denied? Ashford opened his eyes and looked at the instrument panel one last time. The altimeter still showed 32,000 feet. The fuel gauge still showed empty. And scratched into the metal beside the throttle, in letters so small he'd almost missed them, were 3 words. Ich bin free. I am free. Whether they'd been there all along or had appeared in the final moment, Ashford would never know. The official file on the Flensburg-Schaefer House incident was classified in June 1945 and buried in the archives of the Air Ministry. It would remain there for 70 years, gathering dust, forgotten by everyone except a handful of elderly men who'd been present that foggy morning in May. Peter Ashford went on to a distinguished career in aviation. He never spoke publicly about the Focke-Wulf that landed without a pilot. When asked, he would change the subject. When pressed, he would simply say, "Some mysteries are best left unsolved." He died in 1989, at the age of 72. Among his personal effects, his daughter found a small photograph of a German aircraft on a foggy runway. On the back, in her father's handwriting, was written, "For Klaus Richter, who found his way home." The pristine Focke-Wulf FW-190A-8, serial number 173092, officially ceased to exist when it was dismantled. But researchers who've studied the British aircraft collection have noted something curious. There are components in various museums and storage facilities across England, an engine here, a wing section there, a cockpit panel somewhere else, that all bear the same serial number. If reassembled, they would form a complete aircraft. But no one has ever tried to put them back together. Perhaps because of bureaucratic obstacles. Perhaps because of missing documentation. Or perhaps because some part of the organization that classified the file understands that certain things, once separated, should not be reunited. That some aircraft should not fly again. That some missions should end. In Bremen, Greta Richter, she never married, kept his name even though they'd never wed, lived until 1998. She was 92 years old. In her final days, according to the hospice nurses, she would sometimes look out the window at the sky and smile, as if seeing something no one else could see. On the night she died, several residents in her neighborhood reported hearing an aircraft engine overhead, a deep, rhythmic sound, unlike any modern plane. But when they looked up, the sky was empty. And on certain foggy mornings in northern Germany, near the site that once was Flensburg-Schaefer House Airfield, now a commercial development, unrecognizable from its wartime configuration, there are those who claim to hear it still, the sound of a Focke-Wulf FW-190, its BMW 801 engine hammering through the clouds, circling, searching, always searching. Looking for the moment when the fog parts, when the runway appears, when home becomes possible again. Klaus Richter flew his final mission on May 8, 1945. The fact that he'd been dead since December didn't change the reality that he landed that morning, stepped from the cockpit into the fog, and walked toward whatever waited beyond. Perhaps he's still flying, in skies that exist between seconds, in spaces that fold back upon themselves. Perhaps he found Greta after all, in whatever realm waits beyond the edge of what we call real. Or perhaps, and this is what Peter Ashford came to believe in his final years, perhaps Klaus Richter simply proved what we all desperately hope is true, that love, duty, and the need to come home can be stronger than death itself. Strong enough to tear holes in time. Strong enough to fly through impossible storms. Strong enough to land one final time in a world that no longer quite exists, and walk away into a fog that leads somewhere we cannot follow. The war ended on May 8, 1945. But for one German pilot, the war ended in that moment when he unbuckled his harness, pushed back the canopy, stepped onto the wing of his Focke-Wulf, and walked into the mist, toward Greta, toward peace, toward whatever lies beyond the final flight. Ich bin free. I am free.